For today's version of Hear From Her, we are very pleased to have Filipa from EDPR. She's the Head of Client Solutions. So Filipa, maybe if we can start with asking you, what are Singapore's key strategies in increasing the supply of renewable energy?
So Singapore has a net zero target by 2050, and in order to be able to reach that target, it has its energy story, which harnesses the 4 switches. The first switch, which is probably the most reliable one, is on solar development. So it has a target to reach 2 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030, which we at EDPR actively contribute to, and hopefully we will more than surpass this level. It also needs to harness regional grids or importing green energy, which is quite of a challenging aspect of it, but we are working very actively to make sure that we can make this happen. It's very critical for Singapore given the fact that it's such a big importer of gas. The third switch is low carbon solutions, which energy efficiency measures, EV adoption are also very actively contributing to. And last but not least, natural gas, which we at EDPR position as more deployment of hydrogen. So Singapore also has a very interesting path towards hydrogen. It believes that by 2050, more than, I believe, 30% of the energy consumed will be coming from hydrogen. Very exciting to see this story regarding renewables in Singapore.
So you mentioned about the challenges. What are the challenges to actually import green energy into Singapore?
It is indeed very challenging in the sense that it involves a lot of parties, particularly different governments, different countries. From a technical perspective, it is quite feasible. It's not a challenge per se to either build an undersea cable from Indonesia, let's say, or to connect further the grid from Malaysia. When I arrived here in Singapore, so I arrived in March last year, and when I heard about the interconnection projects, I felt it was probably very long time until its deployment. Today, more than a year later, I feel that governments are moving quite fast. We saw a change in tone in Malaysia, lifting the export ban of green energy. The private sector is getting together to make sure that they can actively contribute towards importing green energy to Singapore. From an Indonesia front, we also see a lot of appetite to build green jobs in Indonesia, and they understand that by allowing for exporting energy, it will by far help to promote their own economy given the big and massive off-takers that you have in Singapore. And generally speaking, it is challenging because it involves multiple parties. The private sector, such as EDPR, is actively trying to contribute, but with a lot of different players in the sector. It's those type of projects where you cooperate more than you compete because it's not one single party alone. But even from the government side, I think there's a lot of moving pieces taking place, and hopefully we will see further down this decade a large interconnection project taking place.
So you talked a lot about the different parties that are involved to make things work. So what are the key factors that will determine whether solar energy is cost competitive over time?
Solar has been decreasing its price for the last 2 decades, and so it's really becoming a competitive technology vis-a-vis fossil fuels, for instance. What we've seen in the last couple of months, it's even more substantial. So the price of polysilicon, which is one of the major components in solar, has dropped to its record low given its oversupply in China. And so we have seen panel prices that during COVID stage were a slight increase to what it had achieved over time. Now it's at its records low. So let's say a year ago you would see panel prices at 25 cents per watt. Today you're seeing a record low at 17 cents per watt. So making the technology extremely competitive when it comes to solar deployment. Obviously, it's not just the price of panel that counts when it comes to solar deployment. So it's about a third of an installation comes from the panel prices. On the other hand, you see more costs on the manpower. So rising inflation, more competition in the market, makes it the EPC contractors that are placing themselves in the market, the developers, also pricing a higher cost. All in all, the technology is further decreasing. I think over time, and even specialists say that it should decrease even further. So very exciting to see that our prime technology that we work at EDPR is becoming more and more competitive.
So you talk about the role of technology, but could you share with us what are some of the new technologies in solar that could be game changers?
What is interesting about this space is that you have so much growth going ahead. You have startups positioning themselves with very different technologies. The one that I think it's the most underrated technology or the underdog in the solar space is floating technology. We actually have a 5 megawatt solar farm placed in woodlands in offshore, which is the first in Singapore, and I think it's quite a unique technology because it overcomes some of the challenges of having constraints in land. And particularly in Singapore, that's key given the fact there's such a big scarcity of land available. So water bodies are a very interesting place to place panels, and it doesn't impact the environment. It's very interesting in Southeast Asia in particular because the density of islands and that the offshore water is so mild. So instead of putting panels in reservoirs, you can actually place it in the sea. And so it's exciting to see this growing technology. Other technologies that we're seeing that are interesting is anything that extends the lifetime of a solar panel. And so there's a lot of advanced technology to regenerate the panels, and we're seeing very promising results, even from startups in Singapore. So we're piloting different projects to make sure that we can extend the lifetime of the solar panel, and that is a win-win situation for all, either for our clients, for us all, and it also reduces the recycling of the panel, which is obviously a concern of us that are part of this sector.
So should we be expecting like solar windows on all the buildings in Singapore anytime soon?
Solar windows is definitely also an interesting technology. Such as solar windows, I would say BIPV, so solar panels in the facades of the buildings. Recently, it was announced by HDB, the first pilot of BIPV. It will be a combination of multiple technologies. Solar windows will definitely play a role, and let's see, even though the panel is on a vertical position, which typically will have less efficiency, as the price of solar panels, let's say, decreases over time, for sure it will become a further application. Singapore is such a unique market in the sense that has such a scarcity of land. You really need to be creative on where you put solar or more renewable energy. So windows, facades of the buildings, roads, it's certainly something that we should be further exploring.
So what are the growth prospects for the renewable energy industry, and which are the key growth markets in the next 5 to 10 years?
So renewable energy is booming. I think in APAC, for instance, we expect more than 120 gigawatts per year of solar deployment, which is massive. To give you a perspective, in Australia, which is already a very big country, we deploy about 7 gigawatts per year, or massive growth opportunities in this sector, and particularly in solar. So even though there's some wind resource in APAC, it's particularly more relevant solar, given that there's a very high resource, which is interesting for us, given that at EDPR we have such a big footprint when it comes to solar assets. Obviously, China and India will be leading the way when it comes to solar development or renewable development in general, because it has very sizable population, obviously, and a lot of industrial growth. What is interesting in this part of the world, let's say, it's that more than 60% of the industrial manufacturing output comes from APAC. And so this brings renewables. Today, corporate clients are very interested in making sure that they can start their decarbonization journey and meet their carbon neutrality targets. They are a real route to market for renewables. So government in these countries are further and further announcing more renewable targets, but also the private sector is asking for a route to market to be able to claim their carbon neutrality targets. And so we're very excited to see the growth that is expected in this region.
Could you also share basically for the green hydrogen space, how will it evolve over the next couple of years? And when do you think it will actually move the needle for decarbonization efforts in Asia?
So green hydrogen is certainly one of the technologies that will further accelerate probably in the latter part of this decade, because today the LCOE of producing hydrogen is still not there yet. So it's still not yet competitive with fossil fuels or with other solar or with other renewable sources. But the big advantage of hydrogen is that it allows to store. And so it solves the problem of dependency on fossil fuels. Now, for that, today, we still require a lot of investment that comes from subsidies. Given the fact that it's still not economically viable, you need subsidies from the government. So Europe, US, other parts of the world are actively pushing for a lot of subsidies to hydrogen in specific, not just for renewables in general. But I do see that it will be a very strong contributor, particularly for the very hard to abate sectors. What is important is the proximity of hydrogen to the renewable source. So if we're talking about green hydrogen, it needs to be developed in a place where you have a good access to green energy. And so that's why for Singapore, for instance, probably how we will act, how Singapore will position itself in the hydrogen story will be more in the value chain, less as a producer given the lack of space to produce the green energy, or it has to import in some way. There's still some uncertainties on the economics. A high interest rate environment is certainly not helpful for any business whatsoever, but we see very promising results. I think there already have been announced about 320 billion worldwide investment in hydrogen space to further meet the decarbonisation targets that the world is announcing globally. Everything combined, we need to double that investment over this decade. So I expect to see more and more players positioning themselves in the hydrogen space. We at EDPR have a 1.5 gigawatts of target by 2030 and a dedicated unit to hydrogen, and hopefully we'll see a lot of growing opportunities in the years to come.
Certainly sounds like a very exciting space to watch. So any final words you want to share with our audience?
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I think green energy, renewables, it's a very exciting space, and I hope I could share a little bit about our thoughts about the industry and the sector, and hopefully your clients can also reach out to us if it's convenient to talk about renewable solutions in the space. Thank you so much.